Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will offer an update on the case of Nicholas Alahverdian. First, I'll look at the background of this case, including the timeline of the crimes, then offer my analysis. Nicholas Alahverdian was born on July 11, 1987, in Providence, Rhode Island. He lived with his father, Jack, and his mother, Diana. Unfortunately, Jack had difficulty regulating his intake of substances and may have had problems with aggression. For example, he allegedly killed the family dog in front of Nicholas. Diana divorced Jack and, in 1996, married a man named David Rossi. Nicholas started using his stepfather's name, although he later changed it back to Alahverdian. David implied that Nicholas was very difficult to control and physically violent, referring to him as the devil's spawn. As it turns out, Nicholas was so bad that calling him the devil's spawn may give the devil a valid claim of defamation. Eventually, Nicholas was sent to a mental health facility where he was diagnosed with ADHD and narcissistic personality disorder. When he was discharged, he returned to the family home, but his behavior continued to be disruptive. Nicholas was placed in the care of the Rhode Island Department of Children, Youth, and Families, also known as DCYF. Despite his mental health symptoms, at the age of 14, he was appointed to the position of legislative page in the Rhode Island House of Representatives. Many lawmakers there found him to be industrious and tenacious. They noticed that Nicholas frequently complained to them about the foster care system. He appeared to be interested in advocating for reform. Eventually, the state of Rhode Island sent Nicholas to a program for disruptive teenagers in Nebraska. From there, he was sent to another program in Florida. In 2005, when he returned to Rhode Island, Nicholas was placed in an independent living facility. When Nicholas was 18, he moved to Dayton, Ohio. A married couple there agreed to care for him. In 2008, Nicholas attended a community college. He offended against a female student at the college and was convicted of sexual imposition and public indecency. These are misdemeanor charges, so he was able to avoid prison. Nicholas moved back to Rhode Island and continued complaining about the foster care system. He acted like he was a crusader for justice. In November 2010, Nicholas married, but the marriage only lasted 6 months. Based on bad behavior toward his wife, Nicholas was arrested and pleaded no contest to domestic simple assault. In February 2011, Nicholas filed lawsuits alleging that he was the victim of mistreatment at the hands of DCYF. Ultimately, the lawsuits settled. In 2015, Nicholas married for the second time. His wife filed for divorce 7 months later. He had been arrested for domestic violence after allegedly harming his wife, but she withdrew the complaint. In 2017, a complaint for fraud was filed against Nicholas in the state of Ohio. His former foster mother accused Nicholas of fraudulently obtaining credit cards and loans using her husband's name. Nicholas allegedly ran up almost $200,000 in debt. Eventually, a federal warrant was issued for his arrest. Nicholas left the United States and eventually ended up in England. He became romantically involved with a woman named Miranda Knight, and they married in February 2020. Right after this, Nicholas claimed that he had been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma and supplied this information to a number of media outlets, insisting that they report his condition. A person identifying themselves as Louise Alahverdian and claiming to be the wife of Nicholas published an obituary indicating that Nicholas died on February 29, 2020. She refused to provide his death certificate to a local newspaper. In reality, Nicholas was very much alive. It seems likely that he wrote the fake obituary. This becomes particularly obvious when considering the incredible level of grandiosity contained in the document. The obituary talks about how Nicholas was a warrior who fought on the front lines for 2 decades. His last words were, "Fear not and run toward the bliss of the sun." The obituary indicated that Nicholas was a painter, author, political scientist, sociologist, and child welfare reform advocate. He left out the repeat criminal offender part. His name would be uttered in memoriam in the House and Senate chambers and city halls throughout Rhode Island. At some point after Nicholas faked his own death, he and Miranda moved to Scotland. He pretended to be a professor at the University of Glasgow. Nicholas had a warrant issued for his arrest in September 2020 after his DNA was connected to a 2008 assault of a sexual nature in Utah. The police were running under the assumption that Nicholas was still alive, despite his obituary being published. On December 13, 2021, Nicholas Alahverdian was arrested in Scotland. He was in the hospital at the time, being treated for COVID. The police identified him as Nicholas Alahverdian, but he insisted that he was a businessman named Arthur Knight. He was not from the United States, rather he was an orphan from Ireland. 10 days later, Nicholas was granted bail and left the hospital the next day. After missing a hearing, he was arrested again on January 20, 2022. In early February of that year, he was once again released on bail. At some point, Nicholas returned to the hospital. In July 2022, he was arrested for threatening hospital staff after they told him he could be discharged. This time, Nicholas was not granted bail. In August, he was convicted of threatening hospital staff. In January 2024, after fighting extradition for years and still claiming to be Arthur Knight, Nicholas was finally transported to the United States. It was very clear he was Nicholas Alahverdian based on his physical appearance, fingerprints, and tattoos, but any possible doubt was eliminated after DNA confirmed his identity. Another alleged victim came forward after Nicholas was extradited, which led to him being charged in connection with a second assault of a sexual nature. This offense allegedly occurred during the same year as the other one, 2008. 2 trials were scheduled, one in April 2025 and one in September 2025. When he was awaiting trial, Nicholas requested bail. This put him in a tricky spot because he was still pretending to be Arthur Knight. Lying about his identity reduced his chances of getting bail. During the bail hearing, Nicholas admitted that he was not Arthur Knight, but in fact Nicholas Alahverdian. The only surprising part about this admission was that Nicholas was finally telling the truth. Everybody already knew his real identity. Nicholas claimed that he lied about being Arthur Knight because he had been informed about death threats from credible sources. These threats were in connection with his efforts to reform the Rhode Island DCYF. Nicholas was denied bail. At the time I'm making this video, he is contemplating a plea bargain, which has been offered by the state of Utah. If accepted, this plea deal would resolve both charges. His next hearing is set for December 17, 2024, when, in theory, Nicholas will accept or reject this plea bargain. Now moving to my analysis. Nicholas Alahverdian appeared to be obsessed with honoring himself. He wanted people to view him favorably. This applied not only to his original identity, but to his alternate identities. Nicholas used a number of aliases, including Nicholas Brown, Nick Allen, Arthur Brown, and most famously, Arthur Knight. This demand for admiration remained in place even after Nicholas eliminated his original identity. After faking his death, he diligently worked to get recognition for the original Nicholas. He directed people who were interested in his obituary to an email address which supposedly represented his estate. The need for validation and attention had no limits. One would think that if a person was going to fake his own death, he would avoid making a big deal about it. What is the point of drawing all the attention to the original Nicholas? This certainly would not make it easier to escape from the law. I think that Nicholas was simply looking for praise. It was similar to a person hiding behind their own casket in a funeral home to overhear all the nice things that people have to say. Just to make sure nice things would be said, Nicholas supplied all his accomplishments in the obituary. The challenging part for Nicholas is that he really didn't have any accomplishments. This didn't stop him from claiming them. For example, in 2012, Nicholas took a literature course in a Harvard University extension program. When his criminal history was uncovered, he was removed from the course. Despite this, he claimed to be a Harvard scholar. It would be pretty easy to verify this type of claim, but Nicholas was not really worried about getting caught. He believed that he could deceive anyone, no matter how ridiculous his claims were. For example, when he was in Scotland, Nicholas was identified by his fingerprints and his tattoos. This looked pretty bad for him, but he had an explanation for each method of identification. Nicholas claimed that his fingerprints were taken when he was in the hospital with COVID and sent back to Utah, where the authorities somehow associated those fingerprints with Nicholas Alahverdian. As for the tattoos matching, Nicholas said those tattoos were put on him when he was unconscious in the hospital in Scotland. Just like the fingerprints, this involved a massive conspiracy of the authorities in Utah and Scotland. Everybody was out to get Nicholas. He was always the victim. This brings me to the next question. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Nicholas was self-centered, vindictive, petty, immature, impulsive, irresponsible, arrogant, condescending, cold, callous, antagonistic, aggressive, violent, manipulative, deceptive, vulnerable, needy, controlling, possessed superficial charm, required admiration, had a sense of entitlement, and was exceedingly creepy. Many of his traits aligned with being a victim narcissist. In his mind, everything that Nicholas wanted, he should have received. This includes money, sex, fame, admiration, respect, and revenge. His various criminal acts were not particularly sophisticated, but he was effective in the short run due to his superficial charm. He made a good first impression. However, in the long run, people could see right through him. He was not a master criminal by any measure. In 2020, the authorities started to close in on Nicholas for various alleged offenses. Rather than face the consequences of his behavior, he fled the country and faked his own death, making sure to leave behind a flattering obituary. When the authorities arrested him in Scotland, Nicholas went back to doing something he was good at, playing the victim. He pretended that he was a different person and wasted everyone's time by fighting extradition. Amazingly, some people were actually convinced that Arthur Knight and Nicholas Alahverdian were two different people, but to everyone else, the vast majority of people, it was comically obvious that the authorities had arrested the right person. Nicholas was probably willing to keep up this attempt at deception forever. Knight was never going to fall on the Arthur Knight identity. He only admitted his real identity because he wanted a chance at being released on bail. This effort, of course, failed. As I mentioned, Nicholas has been offered a plea bargain. I don't know the strength of the evidence against him or the terms of the plea bargain, so there's no way to know if it's a good deal or not. At this point, Nicholas is probably more worried about prison time than the damage a criminal conviction would do to his reputation, because his reputation has already been destroyed. Now moving to my final thoughts. As I mentioned, Nicholas was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. This is a cluster B personality disorder, so it's in the same cluster as antisocial, borderline, and histrionic. NPD has been criticized as reflecting traits of grandiose narcissism and failing to capture the vulnerable traits. This is a valid criticism, but it's not the only one. Another problem with this disorder is how it's rarely diagnosed because of the stigma associated with it. Really, this is a problem about how people think about narcissism more so than anything specific to the criteria of the disorder. The word narcissism has become very popular on social media, and it has been distorted. It is often used as being synonymous with evil. This does a great disservice to people who are narcissistic. Mental health clinicians avoid describing their clients with that word, therefore hiding the true diagnostic impression. Many people are empathetic toward individuals who have disruptive personality traits, like being dependent, paranoid, obsessive, histrionic, or avoidant. Being narcissistic, however, rarely attracts empathy. Narcissism is a compassion repellent. To find a great example of this, one does not have to look any further than the case of Nicholas Alahverdian. His behavior was incredibly offensive. Who would feel sorry for him? Who would advocate for him to receive mental health treatment? Who would believe that he is redeemable? People who are narcissistic rarely have any understanding of their behavior. Narcissism does an incredible job at making a person look like they have insight when they really don't. As offensive as Nicholas is, he probably has no clue where his behavior comes from. In the prison of narcissism, the cell is always locked from the inside. Those are my thoughts in the case of Nicholas Alahverdian. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. On social media, it's pretty clear that an entire industry has developed around the construct of narcissism. I think that some of this is okay. Some of it leads to a better understanding of narcissism. People can explore the different traits of narcissism, how those traits express in certain situations. They may learn about this and then reflect on their own lives and realize that they have dealt with people who are narcissistic. They know what to look out for, and they know how to identify these problems. On the other hand, though, I think the expansion of this narcissism industry is destructive. Again, narcissism is often just used in place of the word evil or the word bad. So instead of developing an understanding of what narcissism is, it's really about just a different word for evil. There's nothing really added to the conversation. Nobody's really learning anything. A lot of people become upset when they interact with narcissists, and this has validated their feelings. But that's really just the beginning of this exploration of learning. At least, in my opinion, this should only be the beginning. People should look at what the research has to say about narcissism and learn about how it works. It can be very tempting just to say, oh, this narcissism explains why I was hurt by this person, and leave it at that. Or to vilify that other person, to say, again, that narcissism is bad, it makes them a terrible person, and they really are toxic. They're destructive to society as a whole. People are actually much more complex than this, right? If we take all these different constructs like narcissism, or we look at like borderline or histrionic or antisocial or paranoid, obsessive compulsive, avoidant, we can look at all these different personality constructs, and as wonderful as they are to explain and understand different situations, they don't really capture the nature of being a human being. Personality is extremely complex and really must be examined case by case. So, could narcissism explain why a marriage failed? Could narcissism explain why one person was discriminated against in a workplace? Could it explain why somebody was kicked out of a certain social group? Yes, it can explain a lot of harmful behavior, and that is one of the areas of value as far as studying it. There may be utility as far as that, but when narcissism is used to put people down, to insult people, then we're moving away from science. That has nothing to do with science. That has nothing to do with counseling. Learning about narcissism should be focused on learning, not about labeling people as bad or good. That really doesn't help anybody. So I worry about this trend. I worry about this narcissism explains everything trend on social media, where people get very wrapped up in essentially just repeating the word narcissism and assigning it to various people. That is not science. That is not helpful. That doesn't really do anything. That might be the start to learning. Somebody might say, oh, okay, again, I see there are narcissistic people around me. But that is not the end result. That is not the conclusion. That really doesn't have a lot of utility just by itself. So where will this trend go? Where will the narcissism education or narcissism blame game industry end up? I don't know, but I'm worried it won't be anywhere good. I think that it'll just make it so that clinicians don't want to use that word when referring to their clients, even if it is the appropriate construct to use with certain clients. Even if it could have been helpful at one time, it might not be helpful now because of the stigma associated with the word narcissism.